Good day, philosophers. Here we have another video in our series, and we just finished reading Descartes' Discourse on Method Part 4, and we're moving now to Descartes' Discourse on Method Part 5. Before we jump into the text, there's just a couple things to think about. Remember that we said in the very beginning that Descartes was considered a father of modern philosophy, right? And so in many ways, how is he the father of modern philosophy? Well, in one respect, he's basically made philosophy change. He changed the nature of the kinds of questions that really are the most important questions people seem to ask in philosophy, from classical to what we can now call modern philosophy. But secondly, he presents a new goal for our learning, the goal of usefulness. And he presents it in such a way that will seek usefulness through our knowledge in a way that we never had before. And that's really what we're going to see here in part 5. But let's talk about modern philosophy, right? If we just reflect on what had just happened, the fundamental goal of modern philosophy, based on Descartes' methodological doubt, ultimately becomes a kind of epistemological one. Not so much about what's actually real and true about the nature of reality, but what I can know about the nature of reality, right? So there's this epistemological question where we always begin with this fundamental wondering about if I can really know anything at all. And if I can know something, what justifies me being able to know? Versus classical philosophy, which I would argue, and you might disagree, but classical philosophy, I'd argue, really had more of a metaphysical bent. Not necessarily every philosopher, but for the most part, classical philosophers seem to be fundamentally more concerned with the metaphysical question. Sure, Socrates walked around the city of Athens questioning people about whether they really knew what they thought they knew, because they couldn't ground their ideas on the fundamental definition of the thing that they thought they knew. But underneath that, one of the reasons why he would argue that it was so difficult to grasp a definition is because grasping a definition was connected to a metaphysical reality, the true form of the thing, the perfect ideal essence of the thing. And until you could grasp that form, you don't necessarily know anything at all. But the metaphysical reality was more fundamental, that helped explain the epistemological. Now, in modern philosophy, we aren't as concerned about the nature of reality itself, I would argue, and we're more fundamentally concerned about with these epistemological questions. Similarly, along those lines, then philosophy, which used to be sort of the pinnacle of the university, as we said in our first series around Descartes, that all learning was for the sake of wisdom, to know, and philosophy sort of was the pinnacle of that in universities. Philosophy starts to become more and more specialized, and all of our learning, all of our knowledge becomes more specialized, right? So philosophy, but really kind of digs down into these more pedantic, specific questions about the nature of what you can know at all. And if you think about the methodological doubt, it wasn't like this practical insight that everyone would go through. I could see why people would read philosophy and look at Descartes' metaphysical doubt and say, I could probably live my life just fine without ever having questioned whether the world exists outside my mind. And if that's basically kind of what philosophy has become. That's not a sort of a classical idea of philosophy, which is that the philosophical questions are unavoidable. I would argue that probably going through Descartes' methodological doubt is avoidable for you in your life, but answering questions about what's really real, what we can really know, and what we should do, ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics, those questions are still fundamental. Descartes' sort of approach to trying to get to a foundation, well, some might argue, is not a fundamental kind of experience. And so philosophy becomes this much more specialized thing, focusing on questions like this, right? Even ethics, when we study ethics in a modern way, it's not so much just about what is the right thing to do, but it's about how you can know what the right thing to do is. It's very epistemological, right? And then everything else that used to be part of philosophy starts to become specialized. And so one of the things that we'll see here is when Descartes is talking in part 5 about philosophy, he's fundamentally going to be talking about something that sounds to, like us, much more like science, right? And I remember in high school reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you talk about Victor Frankenstein, right, who was a natural philosopher. He was a scientist, right? So the scientist is used to be part of philosophy, and we'll see that even what we call the modern sciences are now going to be separate from philosophy. Excuse me. Excuse me, I apologize. And even in a university, philosophy now is relegated to some small department inside some antiquated arts and humanities school or something like that. It very rarely is its own college. and yet and it's completely separate from all these other pursuits of understanding. So that is sort of this context here. So let's actually turn to part 5 and start seeing what Descartes' new sense of science is, which for him falls under this still it falls under the notion of philosophy. For us, it's going to start to become a little bit more separate, right? So in part 5 here, we're fundamentally going to be looking at some new discoveries in the nature of reality itself in terms of the physical reality of, and there's something very philosophical about that, but it fundamentally comes down to physics, right? And we're going to first introduce Galileo Galilei. That's the guy whose picture you see right there. There's Galileo, right? And you've probably heard of Galileo. And he's important in history for a lot of things, but you might not realize this, but he's very important for the way mathematics is developed as being an essential part of doing good science, in particular good physics, right? And so really with Galileo, there has developed a new idea of nature and itself and its connection to mathematics, right? Galileo writes that philosophy is written in this grand book, the universe. It is written in the language of mathematics, right? And its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, right? And so here, this idea that nature is written in the language of mathematics, like the philosophy is written into the universe itself, and universe is written in math, right? It's like this idea that we have to wonder, like, for Galileo, and he looks at mathematics, he does not think mathematics is something that is invented, not invented by humans at least. Like, he thinks that humans would discover mathematics, that mathematics of nature is present in nature itself, right? And that if we can discover that mathematics of nature, we can fundamentally understand how nature works, right? And so there's two key ideas to this new idea of nature, right? First, that nature is going to be like a machine, right? And a machine that's governed by certain rules that when one thing bumps up against something else, there's some rule that determines how things happen. And those rules are fundamentally mathematical in nature, right? And this idea is actually novel, right? For us, it might seem kind of obvious. If you guys take a physics class, it was basically a math class, right? It's like some kind of applied math. You do it's mostly formula manipulation and figuring out stuff like that. But for us, we kind of take for granted the mathematical nature of the universe, but that wasn't a thing. We saw other thinkers in the history of philosophy say that there was always mathematics was nice and useful for things. Even Descartes, remember in part 1 of the Discourse on Method, Descartes talks about how math was something that was useful for the mechanical arts, but he is surprised nothing more noble had been made upon its foundations. Well, here in part 5 and then in part 6, we're going to see what that more noble thing is. So let's dig in. Descartes knows about Galileo's idea and is incredibly influenced and now presents it to us in a new kind of way, right? So let's turn and let's read some of the Discourse on Method. Here, the Discourse on Method, here we see Descartes talking about how these supreme laws of nature exist, right? He says, I have always remained firm in the resolution that I had not made to suppose any principle but the one I had just used to demonstrate the existence of God and the soul, and not to accept anything as true that did not seem to me clearer and more certain than the demonstrations of the geometers hitherto seemed, right? So Descartes still is holding on to to believing ideas that are clear and distinct, right? And he says, okay, and nevertheless, I dare say not only that I have found a means of satisfying myself within a short time regarding all the principal difficulties commonly treated in philosophy, but also I had noted certain laws that God had established in nature, and of which he has impressed in our soul such notions that after having reflected sufficiently on these matters, and here's the key thing, we cannot doubt that they are strictly adhered to in everything that exists or occurs in the world, right? Everything in the world is governed by these mathematical laws of nature. Right? Moreover, in considering the consequences of these laws, it seems to me that I have discovered many truths more useful and more important than all that I had previously learned or even hoped to learn. Right? So, in these mathematical laws of nature, which we can discover through our reason, Descartes says this is where I'm going to really find that second goal that I had. We're really going to find something that's useful. The goal of certainty was fundamentally found by carrying out the methodological doubt, which led him to realize, I think, therefore I am, right? And then he built upon that. But here, usefulness is not so much in the I think, therefore I am. It's in this discovery of these mathematical laws of nature, which he think are just as certain as I think, therefore I am, right? So let's continue, right? So Descartes has these notions of these mathematical laws of nature, and fundamental to these mathematical laws of nature is that they are, even in some ways, more fundamental than God. And this is kind of interesting, right? Descartes here talks about these laws of nature. And not only does it say that everything is subject to them, he says, moreover, I showed what the laws of nature were, and without supporting my reasons on any other principle but the infinite perfections of God, I tried to demonstrate all the laws about which one might have been able to have any doubt, and to show that they are such that, even if God had created many worlds, there could not be any of them in which these laws failed to observe. So here's this thing that even with God's, this is a weird kind of statement here because, and this becomes an interesting philosophical problem for someone who argues for the infinite power and infinite goodness and infinite perfections of God. What Descartes suggests here is that even God could not have made the laws of nature different than they were. No matter how many universes exist, these laws of nature, following from the perfections of God, he argues, would ultimately even constrain there being a world in which these laws didn't hold. And so this idea of these laws, we don't have nature operating by other kinds of entities. Aristotle, brilliant philosopher, very important in many respects, was very wrong about the motion of, say, the planets. He thought that there had to be something that was literally moving things, right? There had to be another kind of living thing moving planets, right? That's why I almost talk about the space as the heavens, right, and divine bodies, right, when they're just planets. For Descartes, developing this idea of the mathematical nature of the fundamental nature of the laws of nature as mathematical, he's saying that these laws are the same for everything, right? And he actually continues here in the text. And if we read on, Descartes explains how, based on just these laws of nature, even if the world were sort of began as a kind of chaos, these laws of nature applied to the chaos by God would cause the chaos to inevitably evolve. And he actually has this notion of evolution. Like, evolution is not a new idea. Evolution goes back to at least Democritus in ancient Greece, right? But Descartes talks about how even just by applying the laws of nature to a sort of chaotic matter, they would organize things and things would eventually evolve into the world that we experience it now, right? And so the world that we experience is a kind of machine that's operating according to these mathematical laws. Our goal, the usefulness of this goal, we'll see, will be in understanding these mathematical laws and using them to be able to do stuff we wouldn't be able to do otherwise, right? This becomes very important when we think about the human body, because we have a special place in nature, at least in our own experience, than anything else. We don't seem to be subject to nature in the same way other things are, right? We have reason, we build, we construct, right? And in an old Christian religious sense that Descartes is referring to too, that we as humans are almost made in the image of God, right? And so when we think about even our bodies, if we carry out Descartes' idea, he's even intending that our bodies are a machine just as much as anything else, right? And so here he reflects, and after he talks about sort of the evolution of reality, he starts to talk about bodies. There's this long part where Descartes actually goes into, for pages and pages and pages. Remember, there's one paragraph on Descartes proving the existence of God. There's pages and pages and pages with which Descartes tries to explain how blood flows through the body, right? We're not reading any of that. It's kind of interesting. It's actually wrong. But he's sitting there trying to figure out how blood flows through the body because he takes very literally that our bodies are machines. And so here, after several pages, and we're jumping way down to marginal page 56, we're going to see where Descartes sort of picks up and reflects on what it means to talk about the human body as also as a machine. And here we'll read, Descartes says, "This will in no way seem strange to those who are cognizant of how many different automata or moving machines the ingenuity of men can make, without, in doing so, using more than a very small number of parts in comparison with the great multitude of bones and muscles and nerves and arteries, veins, and all the other parts which are in the body of each animal. For they will regard this body as a machine having been made by the hands of God. So when we talk about what we are a machine. Except what made this machine? God made this machine, right? We are a machine. This body is a machine that's having been made by the hands of God, is incomparably better ordered, and has within itself movements far more wondrous than any of those that can be invented by men. Right? So for Descartes, in this new idea of nature, when we think about God and man, there's something very similar about us. We both are engineers. We both make machines, but not in the same way, right? Humans are like God, but the key difference is the quality of the kind of machines that we make. As Descartes just said, God's machines are incomparably better ordered, and its movements are far more wondrous than the kind of machines that we can make. But notice this blurring of the distinction, right? That God and man are actually much more similar than we are different. Descartes would say we are in the image and likeness of God, but the image and likeness of God is through our ability to create machines, kind of like how he does, right? Now, this is interesting, just as an aside, that this definitely is different than a classical notion of the difference between God and man from a Christian perspective, right? The idea is, what was the difference between God and man? It wasn't just that God made better machines. It was that God and man would fundamentally, if we even talk about our ability to make, God and man are very different in how we make things at all, right? In this ancient concept of the difference between God and man, a human would always make something from something. Whenever we make stuff from other stuff, right? My son's bed literally just broke like a half hour ago. He sat down on it, and the side of it snapped, right? So what am I going to do? I'm going to get some wood, and I'm going to build him a new bed, right? Because that's how I do things. Now, I didn't make that last bed. We bought it online or something, but I'm making the new one. And how am I going to make it? Well, I'm going to get some wood, and I'm going to get some nails. And where did that wood and nails and stuff come from? And glue and all the stuff I'll use? Well, the wood came from trees, and the nails came from the earth. This iron which turned to steel and all kinds of stuff. And then might wonder, okay, well, where did those things come from, right? Those things came from nature. They came from themselves. They were procreating, like all these kinds of stuff. But where does all that come from? Well, think. Man makes stuff from stuff, but God makes stuff from nothing. That was the classical notion, right? That when God creates out of nothingness. There was nothing and then there was something. And why? God willed it into existence. And so Descartes is blurring that distinction. For him, the fundamental difference is not that God makes something out of nothing and that humans make something out of something. He's saying that really we're fundamentally very similar. The key difference between us is that God makes something that's better than what we make, right? And so this poses a question for us. Is there a way that we could become more godlike? In other words, could we make something that's more like what God makes? And Descartes immediately reflects on it here in the Discourse on Method. In the very next paragraph, he starts talking about monkeys, right? And he says, can we make machines that are as wondrous and ordered as God's? And he starts by this. He says, and I paused here in particular in order to show that if there were such machines having the organs in the shape of a monkey, or some other animal that lacked reason, we would have no way of recognizing that they were not entirely of the same nature as these animals. Let's hold on for a second. Essentially what Descartes says is, if we could make a machine that sort of acted like a monkey, we would have no way of telling that it was an artificial monkey versus a natural monkey. Could we make a monkey? Descartes says, yeah, we could make a monkey. Now that's crazy. Could we make monkeys? Right now, it's if you go on YouTube, you can go and take a look at Boston Dynamics, and you'll see all these robots that they're making. And they have these really scary looking. I don't know why they're scary looking to me. Maybe because I saw a Black Mirror episode that sort of had something that looked like this. But you have little like dog robots that can navigate obstacles and do all sorts of crazy stuff. They don't look anything like a dog, but they definitely have some wondrous and ordered movements from very complicated parts. So it seems like Descartes, even in the 1600s as he writes this, is starting to anticipate that humans could actually make machines that are much more sophisticated. What's going to enable us to do this? Our understanding of math, right? Any engineer knows that it fundamentally comes down to the math. If you understand your materials and you're able to work out mathematics, you can combine the mathematics and the understanding of materials and you can actually make something, right? So Descartes says, well, if we could make monkeys and basically anything else, is there a limit? And he says, could we make humans? And that becomes the next thing. So notice he starts talking, and we'll pick up on this text. He says, talking about machines that bear resemblance to our bodies, right? So we have this blurred distinction. We could make a monkey, but could we make a human, right? And Descartes will ultimately talk about two tests about whether we can make a human. Two things, and we'll read them in the text in just a second. The first thing he'll say is, can we make a machine that uses words or other signs to declare thoughts to others? Could we make a machine that's adaptable to unforeseeable events, that can respond to all the contingencies of life using like reason as a universal instrument? So let's reflect on those two things, right? So, like for instance, first of all, can we create machines that use words or other signs to declare thoughts to others? I've got a cell phone, right? I have a Google Pixel. A lot of people have iPhones. iPhones have Siri. My Google Pixel has the Google Assistant, which doesn't really have a name. It's kind of a little less personalized. I don't know, something about Apple having Siri tries to make it sound more personal. But do we have machines that can speak, right? I could ask my phone, hey, how's it going? And let's see what it says.
Life's pretty good when I'm helping you out.
Oh, I'm so glad that life's good when it's helping me. I could have a conversation with my phone right now. It uses words but is it declaring thoughts? And that's the question, right? One might argue, no, right? Every response that this guy has is sort of programmed, right? Let's just read the text and then I'll come back to reflecting on these two things some more. So when Descartes talks about whether we can make humans, far more wondrous things like that, he says, if there were any such machines that bore resemblance to our bodies and imitated our actions as far as this is practically feasible, we would always have two very certain means of recognizing that they were not at all for that reason true men, right? There's two. So Descartes says, we probably can't make humans. But even in saying that we probably can't and giving us two criteria, I feel like he's actually implying that maybe we can. And here's the criteria. First, he says that they could never use words or other signs or put them together as we do in order to declare our thoughts to others. And just like I said. And finally, the second is that although we might perform many tasks very well or perhaps better than any of us, such machines would inevitably fall in other tasks. And he continues on, that are always limited. But let's go to these things. We certainly do have machines that can do way more than just one task. In the past, when you made a machine, it could do one thing. And that's it. Now we have machines that can do lots of things. And we also have machines that seem to be able to use words. But the key here is when a machine uses words, when my Google Assistant used words just then, was it declaring thoughts? Does this phone have thoughts? That's the real question, right? Just because you can use language doesn't necessarily mean you have thoughts. But how do you know that something is a thought or rather just in a use of word? Descartes' idea of this first test actually is mimicked later on. In the 20th century, there's a guy named Alan Turing, right? And I hope you've heard of Alan Turing. Interesting guy. There was a movie made about Alan Turing and his role in the World War II, right? It was World War II, right? Yes, World War II would have to be, where he was involved in code breaking and stuff. It was called The Imitation Game. Movie worth watching. But one of the things that I'm pointing out here has nothing to do with anything that's in that movie. Alan Turing developed something called the Turing Test, which was a kind of experiment that would try to test the limits of artificial intelligence. Say you had a computer, right? How could you, a computer that uses language, just like this guy uses language, how could you test to see if this thing really is just as intelligent as a human, or has intelligence at all. And so Turing came up with this test. And basically what he would do is he would have a human that would send and receive text messages, not text messages like on your phone, but messages that were text with two subjects. One of them was a human, another was a computer. And after the human had a conversation and exchange with this with these two subjects, the original human would have to decide which one was the human and which one was the computer, right? And if the computer could successfully mimic a human so well that it seemed even more human than the human, then it's passing Turing's test, right? And so actually there's Turing test competitions held all the time, and people are constantly developing artificial intelligence these days, and they're subjecting them to this Turing test, right? There's been a lot of movies that try to present something kind of like the Turing test, and here's at least these are actually, some of these are TV shows. But have you ever seen the movie Ex Machina? It explicitly talks about the Turing test, and it presents a kind of new level of a Turing test where the character encounters something that he knows is a machine, but is supposed to enter into a relationship with that machine and to see if he could have a real relationship essentially with the machine, to care about the machine the same way he would care about another human, right? Something similar, just beneath that, would be the film AI with Haley Joel Osment, I think is what his name was, right? And the movie AI was actually a Stanley Kubrick idea of a film that he never made before he died, but Steven Spielberg went ahead and made the movie. And a very, very long movie. And a lot of people didn't like it. I really, really liked it. And this movie has this child, that little guy right there, Haley Joel Osment. He's a little robot, right? And as a viewer of this movie, you're constantly torn as to how much you care about this kid. Do you relate to this kid as an actual human, or do you relate to this kid as a robot? And you actually encounter a family who has a child who dies, and then takes in this robot child to sort of be a replacement for their own human child. And they have this mother that has this constant tension going back and forth, where in some ways she relates to this robot like it was her own son, and in many ways she realizes that this robot is just a robot. You have this tension. Can you in a more extreme Turing test, is it not just that you could be tricked into thinking that the text messages came from a human, but could you actually love a robot the way you would love a human, right? Two more examples. The TV show, which is on HBO right now, Westworld. I saw bits and pieces of it, but it also has this sort of world where you engage with these robots and in relationships, and some of the robots are clearly not fully intelligent, but others seem to be, and now it's an interesting kind of Turing test. And also Battlestar Galactica, we also have something like that play out, and I'm not going to describe it. But lots of interesting shows take on this idea of the Turing test and sort of push us in science fiction to think about the limits. Fascinating thing here, Descartes in the Discourse on Method, right? In this book written in the 1600s, sets the foundation for us even thinking about artificial intelligence today. Sets up a criteria which evolves into something like the Turing test that we even use to actually test things, and is great source for science fiction for us, right? So Descartes fundamentally sees usefulness in this new idea of nature. He says that we could understand nature well enough that we could become like God in nature, that we can make things in a godlike way. And from here, we're gonna pause. We're gonna turn to part 6 of the Discourse on Method, where Descartes really going to reflect on all the uses that could actually be found based on these new laws of nature. Have a beautiful day, and I'll catch you on the flip side.